There's been a lot of focus in CEO succession work on external CEOs coming in and taking over large organizations. And I think it's pretty well understood that there's real significant challenges in doing that in terms of learning about the new organization, adapting to the culture, and so on. What is not as well understood is that internal promotions to CEO can be equally as challenging, although for very different reasons. And in fact, research shows that those internal promotions are far more frequent in practice than CEOs coming in from the outside. PwC does an annual global survey of CEOs, and this survey showed in 2018 that 83% of CEO successions involved internal promotions. So most of the research I do is about leaders taking new roles, right? How you can set yourself up for success in the first 90 days and so on. But I also get very interested in particular types of transitions. And in this case, I was working with a colleague, Andrew Chastain, CEO of Watkins, big US-based search firm, really focusing in on the particular challenges of CEO succession. And in looking at it, we realized that there was really quite a bit that had been written about external CEOs coming in, but almost nothing about internal transitions, right? And there was almost an assumption this should be easy, right? You're known quantity, you've got everybody's confidence. I mean, how hard can it be, basically, was kind of the attitude. But it turned out when we talked to some of these folks, it really wasn't the case. They faced real challenges. They were different challenges than externals, but they were significant and serious. And so that led us to start doing, a series of interviews, beginning to dig into the issue a little bit more, with a view to trying to really distill out what are the core challenges that these internally promoted CEOs face. So when we went through the results of the interviews and really tried to distill things out, we found 5 big themes, 5 big challenges that internally promoted CEOs face. The first is really that they had a past in the organization, right? And you'd think that would be great. They're well known, people understand them, have confidence in them. But the reality is that the previous roles they played really shaped people's perceptions of them. And so, for example, a CFO who has been promoted to be CEO, there can be an assumption that they're going to continue to be very financially oriented, they're going to continue to be focusing on returns exclusively, and that can really present challenges when they try to transform into being a true CEO. And so you've got to be very purposeful about reshaping your personal brand away from that set of perceptions and maybe purposely biasing yourself in other directions to really show that you're not narrowly focusing on the sorts of things that you've focused on in the past. Second big challenge is really that you have supporters inside the organization who may have pretty high expectations of what you're going to deliver. And they may therefore be quite shocked when you have to make hard choices that are not necessarily so favorable to them, right? It can be, how can you be doing this to me, right? I was a crucial supporter for you. I thought you were going to help, sustain the agenda I'm trying to pursue, and here you're goring my metaphorical ox. But the reality is, as a CEO, you have to make the right business choices. You're reporting to a board. But this can really create real tensions with the very people who were the supporters that brought you to the table, if you will. A third big challenge that internally promoted CEOs face is the reality that they're now leading people who were formerly their peers, some of whom may have been competitors for the job, and who may be quite disappointed, right, that they didn't get it, or may have had challenging relationships with them. And so that new CEO really has to grapple with the reality that they've got work to do with their team to really figure out whether some of those people can continue to work with them, and sometimes it's just not possible. The sooner you can figure that out as a CEO, the better, right? Because you can begin to think about how do you move people beyond the current role, to someplace else. But often there's really good people you want to retain. And they're not necessarily terribly comfortable with the fact that you're now supervising them, managing them. They may have some real disappointment, right, about the fact that they didn't get the role. So how do you re-enlist those people? How do you really pull them back in? How do you give them a sense of motivation, excitement that they've got a future still in the organization so you don't lose this really valuable talent? A fourth big challenge that internally promoted CEOs face is really carefully thinking through how they're going to pace the change that they want to have happen in their organizations. There's one CEO we talked to as part of the interviews who spent 5 years, one level down, making a list of all the things he wanted to do when he was finally in the top chair. And so he went forward and tried to implement too many things too quickly and really overloaded the organization. So you really have to be careful to think through really what are the key priority changes you want to make, what's the organization's capacity to absorb change, and not fall into the trap of trying to do everything at once, even if you've sort of spent a lot of time building up some real energy about all the things that you're going to do in the new organization. Finally, there can be really big challenges associated with managing the departure of your predecessor. Often the case is that this person is going out after a very successful career, maybe having spent decades with the organization, but it's not easy for most people in that situation to let go of the levers of power, to accept that you're moving on to a new place. And there can be some unfortunate things that happen in terms of almost a kind of competitiveness that can occur between the incoming CEO and the outgoing CEO. So I always advise the new CEO to make sure that a lot of attention is paid to the exit process for the outgoing CEO, that they're really celebrated, their legacy is recognized, that a carefully articulated process for the transfer of power is put in place so that you don't hit these unnecessary points of, for example, confusion over who's making the key calls or behaviors that are undermining the new CEO in some way. While the research we did really focused on CEOs, the reality is that most leaders at senior levels who are being promoted from the inside experience some of these challenges. For example, having a pent-up sense of wanting to make change and trying to make too much happen, or dealing with the fact that you're now leading former peers, or grappling with the reality that people have a certain viewpoint of you, your brand, if you will, that needs to be reshaped. So although there are, of course, differences, unique to the CEO situation, many of the challenges are actually far more common across the organization. As a new internally promoted CEO, the starting point, of course, is to be aware of these challenges and begin to think about how you're going to address them. But there's a really critical piece about being sure that you're getting good feedback early on about how things are going. When I coach a CEO, external and internal, I always set up a feedback process at about the 90-day mark, designed to really give a good sense, a snapshot of how things are going. And I've designed an instrument that really is designed to help support that process, because there's a tendency not to give a new CEO honest feedback about how they're doing, right? There's a desire to build a good relationship on the part of people below you, and so it's easy to get into a bubble if you're not very careful. And so I always recommend that new CEOs bias themselves in the direction of getting some really good feedback early on. Primary responsibility for dealing with these challenges, of course, rests with the new CEO. But there are some things the organization can do to help support the process. One example is helping to support the process of getting some feedback early on for the CEO in a way that gives them some genuine input about how things are going. The HR organization can help them think through the relationships with their former peers and what are the key things that need to be done to re-enlist some of the best players or figure out what to do with people who potentially may need to move on to new things. And of course, communication is really so critical. And so the right communication support focused on how that new CEO is going to rebrand themselves in the context of their new role can be tremendously helpful, especially early on in this process.